and welcome to Arbitral Insights, a podcast series brought to you by our international arbitration practice lawyers here at Reed Smith. I'm Jose Estegaraga, Global Head of Reed Smith's International Arbitration Practice. I hope you enjoy the industry commentary, insights, and anecdotes we share with you in the course of this series, wherever in the world you are. If you have any questions about any of the topics discussed, please do contact our speakers. And with that, let's get started. Welcome, everyone, to Arbitral Insights, Reed Smith's podcast series on international arbitration. I'm Jose Estegaraga, the Global Chair of Reed Smith's International Arbitration Practice, and I'm delighted to welcome today a very special guest to our program, Alexis Mourre, the President of the ICC. As no doubt you know, this year marks the culmination of Alexis's tenure as President of the ICC Court of Arbitration. Given the transformation the ICC has undergone in his leadership, we thought it would be very valuable and interesting to ask Alexis to reflect on his presidency, ask him about the changes and innovations he led, and as well to ask him about his vision for the future. This is part one of our two-part series. So with that, Alexis, welcome to the program.
Hello, Jose. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, with that, Alexis, let me get right to it. You are finishing your term of, or two terms now, totaling 6 years as president of the ICC. Your tenure has been marked, and I'm not saying this just to be nice, I'm saying it because it's the reality, of been marked by innovation and change at the ICC. And I thought that it would be particularly interesting to our listeners to take advantage at this juncture to, in effect, ask you to reflect a bit on given that you have a unique vantage point in the world of international arbitration, as well as with respect to the ICC, to reflect a bit on your tenure, as well as to look towards the future. I thought that during this podcast that we would look at three aspects, Alexis. One is the state of international arbitration in general. Number two, to talk about some ICC-specific aspects, and then finally, to in effect talk to you about, a little bit about your personal views towards the future and plans, and perhaps some advice you might have for folks interested in international arbitration. So let me ask you first about your view of international commercial. I'll focus on commercial arbitration first. In your view, what are the three biggest challenges facing international commercial arbitration today?
Thank you, Jose. That's a very broad question, and there are many. If I had to list three, I would say in no particular order. One is certainly the phase of transition that arbitration is at the moment undergoing. Some talk about a legitimacy crisis. There is certainly a process of more diversity, more regionalization. There is a demand on the part of users for more efficiency. Of course, the question of ethics and transparency is on the top of the agenda of all main institutions. So that overall is a process of change which will have important consequences. A second one is the question of artificial intelligence and ODR, which I think will moving forward change a lot of things for arbitration. The advent of predictive justice may, of course, have long-term very significant consequences. It is a question that is pretty much linked to transparency as well, because you will have no predictive justice if the data is not available, and the data are the awards. ODR, of course, is a question which will be very important in the years to come. And thirdly, something that I see as a challenge is to maintain, moving forward, the liberal regime which has been put in place since the New York Convention for International Commercial Arbitration. And we need to avoid what I see as a potential for contamination coming in particular from consumer law. That is something that is particularly pregnant in North America. The regime of international commercial arbitration is extremely liberal because it applies to international commercial arbitration. If it were to apply as well to cases where you have a weak party involved, or case of consumer law, employment law, then I think moving forward you would have a regulatory backlash for arbitration, and that will be a challenge also, as a recent case in Canada has shown.
Excellent, Alexis. Obviously, there's a lot to unpack in what you've said, and we're going to cover a couple of those in particular. But let me ask you, you touched on artificial intelligence. Obviously, we've sort of all speculated or had some fun with the idea of whether robots will ever replace arbitrators. But my question there is, what, say, in 10 years, what role do you see for artificial intelligence, specifically in the context of a substantial commercial arbitration?
Yes, I don't think, and I hope that we will not see in the future robots arbitrating. Arbitration is fundamentally a human activity. It is men and women casting a judgment with their moral values on other men and women, and I don't think that can be done by a robot. Nonetheless, I think that artificial intelligence will disrupt our life as we know it today in two ways. The first is ODR and the management of arbitration cases completely online with still an arbitrator somewhere, but ODR as a platform to allow parties, in particular low-value cases, to have access to a more efficient and quicker justice. And the second one is predictive justice. As I said, predictive justice supposes that a large mass of awards be made available to the analysts. So it's pretty much linked to transparency as well. For us, as you know, at the ICC, the publication of awards has been and is an important policy. I think that it will be a pillar for the development of predictive justice. In a certain number of areas of international litigation where cases are fairly simple, repetitive, if the data is available to analysts, then you will be able in the future to have softwares allowing to analyze that big data and to provide a prediction as to what the outcome of a case might be. And this, of course, will encourage settlements, will encourage mediations, and it will allow parties to prepare their case better.
Very, very interesting. Let me ask, Alexis, if you were able to make one change, you're limited to one change, but you had the power to make it, what would be the one change you would make in the practice of international commercial arbitration?
Well, the one thing I would aspire to, and it's something that the ICC has worked on and we have introduced to a certain extent, but not fully, is the question of transparency in general, and in particular the systematic publication of awards. I think and I hope that arbitration will move away in the years to come from its culture of secrecy, from the idea that arbitration should be secret or confidential. I think that publishing awards, and it should in the future, I hope it will no longer be based on consent. The ICC, as you know, has moved to an opt-out system. Perhaps we could dream of a system in the future whereby, as a matter of principles, awards would be available to the public unless both parties agree to the contrary. That would be a revolution. So if there is one systemic change that I would aspire to see in the 10 years to come, it would be this: to have the entire system of arbitration, institutions and parties moving into a system where confidentiality would become the exception and transparency would become the principle.
That's very interesting. I can tell you that certainly from the standpoint of a practitioner that from time to time, of course, needs to make arbitrator selections. Certainly the greater transparency would be wonderfully helpful as you try to anticipate. You talk about predictive justice. A lot of what we do now is very simply, in effect, try to predict, but really without the tools or the information, which leads me into the question of arbitrator challenges. At one point, arbitrator challenges were de rigueur. Do you foresee the trend, of arbitrator challenges increasing, decreasing, staying the same? What is your view currently of that issue?
What we have seen in the ICC since 2016 is interesting. It's certainly a trend to more challenges. We had in 2016 50 challenges filed, and we had last year 92. So it's a significant increase. Nonetheless, the number of challenges accepted by the court has remained even. 5 in 2016, 5 in 2020. It has been 6, 7, depending on years, but it has remained substantially at the same level. So yes, we might see more challenges. More challenges, I think, is not necessarily a bad thing. It means that perhaps there are more information. Perhaps transparency translates into more challenges. And you will need to see institutions being robust in rejecting those challenges that are meritless. But yes, based on the evidence that we have at the ICC, saying that the number of challenges may increase is perhaps true. Some of the changes that we have introduced, for example, the requirement of disclosure of the existence and identity of a third-party funder might translate into more challenges, which is fine. Again, challenging an arbitrator is a right of a party. What would be fundamentally negative would be that challenges are not made because disclosures are not made and the information is not made available to the parties.
Perfect. Understood. Alexis, let me ask you this. Let's talk geography. We've seen the growth of regional centers in the past 20 years, say, and I know you personally have expressed that is a healthy thing for international arbitration. At the same time, there's also an element of competition for among the centers, including the ICC and regional centers and so on. Fast forward 10 years, what effect do you believe that the growth of regional centers will have upon international arbitration in general and upon the major arbitral institutions such as the ICC in particular?
Well, you don't need to look in 10 years from now. This is something that is a reality already today. 10 years ago or 15 years ago, essentially the ICC would be alone on the market with very little competition. Now it's an entirely different ballgame. Of course, we are seeing the emergence not only of regional institutions, but also of local institutions, which, as far as the ICC is concerned, is, of course, a challenge because the ICC is by nature a global institution, so it needs to offer its services globally. But there is an increasing requirement on the part of users and parties that we be more present on the ground, closer to them, which explains the moves that we have made to regionalize our services and to open case management offices around the world. So this has many effects for us because it obliges us to compete globally and also to be more local, to be more global in a way. I think it will also change the dynamic of arbitration globally in the sense that more robust institutions locally and regionally is something that energizes the arbitration communities around the globe. It contributes to increasing the diversity of the arbitration community, and that can be only good. Competition and diversity and regionalization go hand to hand, and they contribute to making arbitration stronger.
That's perfect, and I agree on the value of that is provided by regional and local centers. I wonder if one side effect, one consequence, Alexis, of that is that this growth of regional and local centers results in less standardization in the practice of international arbitration. I'm referring to things like the IBA rules that on evidence that develop best practices, across legal traditions, civil and common law, and so on. I ask it, Alexis, because I had as you know, I had the privilege of co-chairing the ICC's task force on the value of witness evidence. And we conducted among the task force a survey among the members who, of course, came across the globe of things like, well, how do you process witness evidence and so on? And I was struck by the answers that we received about really the variety of views and practices with respect to witness evidence and so on. And my point is, while on the one hand, a global institution like the ICC can help spread best practices and so on, and the IBA rules similarly have, such a harmonizing effect, does the growth of regional centers result in the atomization of the practice of international arbitration, which, in a certain sense is good because it's more responsive to local needs. In another sense, it's not good because it creates barriers to entry, and similarly as well, parties can feel not as comfortable if they don't have the same level of familiarity, if you would, as where they could say, well, we're going to have sort of a uniform or a commonly accepted standard. Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I would not say that the growth of local or regional institutions is a phenomenon that leads to atomization of arbitration in terms of its practices and rules. What we have seen in the past 10 years, if anything, is that at the same time, arbitration has grown as a more diverse environment with the emergence of arbitration communities in different parts of the world, the emergence of new arbitral centers in different parts of the world, and at the same time, it has maintained the consistency of its practices and values. What we have seen, but I don't see that as a phenomenon that is related to the emergence of regional centers, is a certain phenomenon of renationalization in a way of arbitration, which has operated, I think, in some limited parts of the community. You mentioned the IBA rules on evidence. We know the debate with these Prague rules that have been launched at some point. These are tendencies which I see as regressive one, in the sense that if arbitration has brought anything, it is the ability for parties around the world to litigate by speaking the same language. And that is fundamental. You can have a claimant in Japan with a respondent in California, arbitrators in Brazil, France, or South Africa, all speaking the same procedural language, thus establishing a level playing field. And that is fundamental. If arbitration moves away from that, arbitration will die. This is fundamental. Nonetheless, there have been some tendencies of, on the one side, which I define as protectionism. You have seen that in Peru with a draft rule recently, in other parts of the world with attempts to exclude, for example, foreign arbitrators from certain jurisdictions, or to establish state control on institutions, which is, of course, very negative, and attempts to move away from the global practice of arbitration, from the existence of a core transnational rules applying to arbitral procedure. The Prague rules are part of that. I expressed my views on this, and I always thought that this was unnecessary and aggressive in a way. But these are two distinct phenomena, I would say.
Okay. Well, you mentioned Japan, Brazil, number of countries. So let me just talk to you about geography. What, in your mind, what is the next region of the world where international arbitration will become, the modern marketing phrase, the next big thing? In other words, where is the growth market that you see for international arbitration?
Well, the growth market, of course, is already there. The main region where arbitration is growing and will continue to grow is Asia. That's absolutely certain for very objective and economic reasons that are easy to understand. The region where we will see more development, I hope, is Africa. Africa is the region where there is the most potential, I would say, for arbitration. It is the region where there is the need for more efforts and more development of the local arbitration community. There are not enough African arbitrators in ICC tribunals, in tribunals from all institutions. The community, the African community, is not strong enough, is not present enough in the arbitration forum, and all institutions need to make a tremendous effort on this plane. But I would say that overall, we still are not where we should be. If you look at our statistics, for example, we do report or confirm at the ICC roughly 1,600 arbitrators every year. Still now, almost 70% of that population originates from Western Europe or North America. And that is not reflective of the reality of arbitration today. So we need more arbitrators from Asia, more for Latin America, even though the community is very strong in Latin America already, and certainly a big effort to be made in Africa and in the Middle East as well.
Alexis, in terms of Africa, do you see a distinction between Francophone Africa, the rest of Africa, Northern Africa versus the rest of Africa?
Yes, of course. These are different cultures, different histories, and different markets, although there are points in common. But Francophone Africa and Anglophone Africa have their own different characteristics, of course.
I was thinking of whether the ICC would, just have a natural advantage or focus on Francophone Africa.
I don't think so. The ICC is, from that perspective, is really perceived as a global institution. It's not perceived as a Francophone institution at all.
Yeah. No, that's for sure. It's just an additional advantage that it would have because of the history. But, well, let me ask you, you mentioned Asia. Are you including India in that?
Yes, of course.
Perfect. And the reason I wanted to hone in and focus on India, do you have a view on the future growth of arbitration in India in particular?
Arbitration has been growing very significantly in India. Since I became the president, I must have been to India more than 10 times, more than once a year, every year, and perhaps twice a year. It's a very, very impressive market with an immensely skilled community of lawyers there. India is still handicapped to a certain extent by the judiciary and by a number of characteristics, court intervention, arbitrations, stays, anti-suit injunctions, which need to be overcome. But India is an immense market. India will grow. We will see more good, reliable institutions appearing in India. The Mumbai Center has done a very good job so far, but we will see more. I'm sure that India will become a very, very important center for arbitration in Asia in the years to come.
Well, thank you, Alexis. Let me conclude this section of our conversation by asking you one last question. What is your view on the future of London as an arbitral seat in light of Brexit?
I don't think that Brexit will affect London as an arbitral seat. In fact, it may well have the effect of developing London for a number of investment cases for the reason that we all know. Perhaps on the long run, Brexit may have an effect if Brexit has the consequence of weakening the legal community in London. We know how much large London law firms have grown on the financial market. So we'll have to see whether in 20 years from now the city is as strong as it used to be in the past, and that may have an indirect effect on arbitration. But I think that apart from that, in the years to come, Brexit will not weaken London as an arbitration seat.
Thank you, Alexis, for joining us today. To our listeners, we hope you've enjoyed this very, very interesting interview with Alexis, and this will conclude part one of our two-part series. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and please be on the lookout for part two of our interview with Alexis coming soon.
Arbitral Insights is a Reed Smith production. Our producer is Ali McCardle. For more information about Reed Smith's global international arbitration practice, email Jose Estigaraga at jia@reedsmith.com. You can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple, Google Play, Stitcher, reedsmith.com, and our social media accounts at Reed Smith LLP on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. This podcast is provided for educational purposes. It does not constitute legal advice and is not intended to establish an attorney-client relationship, nor is it intended to suggest or establish standards of care applicable to particular lawyers in any given situation. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. All rights reserved.